So this is our second video in Unit 2, and it's going to focus on passive transport. So if we take a minute and look at that word, passive means to allow something to happen without exerting any sort of force or energy. So this is going to be moving things across the cell membrane without the use of energy. So let's review a little bit from the last video. Every cell exists in a liquid environment. We touched on this last time when we talked about the hydrophilic heads of the phospholipids in the cell membrane and the hydrophobic tails. So the inside of the cell, we have cytoplasm, which is a liquid that is water-based. So that's why the hydrophilic heads tend to go inside. And then they also face outside because we have outside the cell an extracellular matrix. And this basically refers to anything outside the cell. It's kind of similar to cytoplasm in that it's a little wet and gooey, but it's sometimes has other stuff in it. You don't really need to know that much about it. Just that both inside and outside the cell, we've got water-based liquids. And like we talked about last time, the cell membrane regulates what enters and leaves the cell. So basically, it is going to be regulating the movement of molecules from the liquid on the outside of the cell to liquid on the inside the cell, or vice versa. You can see down here, we have our membrane. You're starting off with a lot of particles outside the cell. Those particles are going to be moving inside across the membrane until we get a pretty even distribution. So before we can really talk about how this happens, we need to talk really briefly about how to measure concentration. So the cytoplasm of a cell contains a solution of many different substances in water. Just as a reminder, in case you don't remember what a solution is from a previous class, a solution is a mixture of two or more substances, and the thing that's dissolved is going to be called the solute. So if we're thinking about salt dissolved in water, the salt would be the solute, and together the salt and the water would make up the solution. The concentration of a solution is how much solute you have dissolved in the solution. So if we take a look at the two beakers below, the one on the left has the same number of particles as the one on the right, but the right has a higher volume of liquid. So which one of these is going to have a higher concentration and why? Take a moment, pause the video, and think about it. If you said that the beaker on the left has a higher concentration, then you're right. This is because it has a lower volume. So when you divide out the mass of the, for example, salt that you have dissolved in the water, divided by a lesser volume of water, then that's going to result in a bigger number. That's why the beaker on the left would have the higher concentration. So the first process we're going to talk about is diffusion. In a solution, the particles that are dissolved are going to be moving about constantly. They're colliding into each other, bumping into each other, and this movement is random. So it's not really movement with a purpose. As a result, these particles move from an area where they are more concentrated to an area where they are less concentrated, and this is diffusion. So make sure to write down that diffusion is when particles move from an area where they are more concentrated to an area where they are less concentrated. You can see this happening over here. We have some sort of porous membrane. There's more particles over here, and then they're going to move generally from the left to the right until we get to a state where they're still moving around, but they're doing so in a way where they're staying at relatively the same concentration on each side of the membrane. And when we get to a point where the concentration is about equal, we say that it has reached equilibrium. So this is an important word to note down. You can remember if it's equal, it has reached equilibrium. So what does this have to do with the cell membrane? If a substance is present in unequal concentrations on either side of a cell membrane, its particles will cross the cell membrane toward the lower concentration until it reaches equilibrium. So this is only if the particles are able to cross the cell membrane. particles that are charged, like ions, if they have a positive or negative charge, or if they're just plain old too big, they can't cross this way. And we'll talk about how charged molecules and large molecules cross membranes in another video. But to remember with diffusion, we're just going to have particles crossing that membrane until we get to a point where it's in equilibrium, where you have about the same concentration inside and outside the cell. Because diffusion depends upon the random movement of particles, substances diffuse across the cell membrane without requiring the cell to use energy. It's also very important to note the particles don't stop moving just because equilibrium is reached. They continue to move across the cell membrane, like in this picture, in both directions. But because they move across the membrane in about equal numbers, there's no change in the concentration. So they're not still, there's no net movement. Now we're going to talk about a specific case of diffusion, and that's called osmosis. So many substances can diffuse across a membrane, but when we talk specifically about water, then we're talking about osmosis. So water passes easily across the membrane. Many other types of molecules cannot, but osmosis is the diffusion of water throughout a selectively permeable membrane. So this is when it's going to cross from one side to another of a membrane that doesn't allow every single thing to move across it. Here, you've got some particles dissolved in water. Those particles are in an unequal concentration. We have the same amount of water on each side of the beaker. You can see that really faint membrane in between. However, these sugar molecules can't move across the membrane. So what's going to happen is that the water itself is going to move from one side to the other. Because there's a higher concentration of the sugar molecules over here on this side, water is actually going to move from the right side to the left in order to create an equal concentration. So you can see over here, water has left the right side. It's gone over to the left side, resulting in a higher volume of water, but actually this is causing the concentration to become equal. So let's look more carefully at this. There are more sugar molecules on the left side of the membrane than the right. That means that the concentration of water molecules is lower on the left than on the right. The membrane was permeable to water, but not sugar. So this means that the water can cross the membrane in both directions, but the sugar can't. As a result, there is a net movement of water molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration.